Hello and welcome back. In this video we're going to look at a common problem that occurs when you do a fairly aggressive amount of processing in an image in Photoshop. And to look at this, we're going to look at this image of Balthur in Snæfellsnes in Iceland. And this image started off as a bit unimpressive. The lighting was poor, there was a lot of haze, and I wanted to make something a lot more aggressive. But in that process, what we ended up with was an image that had some issues with fringing around the edges, as you can see here, and also introduction of a bit of noise due to some fairly aggressive use of filters and processing with various Photoshop plugins. And so what we're going to show you is how you can end up with something that looks much better and without having to go back and start over. So let's have a look at the first steps. Now let's just say from the outset that a lot of these problems that have occurred in this image came about because the initial masking of the selections we wanted to use in the image wasn't quite as perfect as we thought they were. So let's go back to the original image and let's have a look at how we made a selection in the initial stages. And what we did was we made a selection based around the sky, and if you look at the marching ants, it looks perfectly okay. We've picked up the edges of our figure pretty well, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that it was all fine. And so we went ahead and started working on the image, and then once we'd carried out a lot of work on the image, and I'll just remove that selection, we found that, well, the selection wasn't quite as perfect as it ought to have been, and in the course of some of this processing we've introduced a little bit of color bleeding over into the sky areas. Now I have to emphasize that this is a very aggressive amount of editing on this image, and it's really created a piece that speaks to the drama that I felt was appropriate to the image. And rather than go back and start doing this all over again with a better selection or modifying the selection, we can fix this up fairly simply using a couple of tools. And the final thing I'm going to do is use the Topaz Denoise plugin to remove some of that unwanted noise that's crept into the image. So the first thing we want to do is we want to work out how to get rid of that nasty fringing around the edges. Now the first thing you might think is, well, we can just simply clone over those edges using the clone tool, but that introduces another problem. I've already created the solution to this, so I'm just going to ignore those two layers for the moment. And if we create another layer, and I'll just drag that down to just above my processing steps, and if we start to use this with the normal clone tool, we start to find a problem. And I'll do this a little bit larger so that it's easier to see. But if we were to just simply try and clone from these edges here, you start to then lose the detail of the edges of the figure, and it ends up being very messy and murky. So that doesn't work. But what we can do, we can change the way we do this, and I'm just going to delete that layer, and we'll start again with a new blank layer, and we'll be cloning on this layer. And we still use the clone tool, but we use the power of blending modes to make this work for us. And this only works when our area that we're cloning from is lighter than the area we're cloning against, such as the sky against a dark figure. And the way we do this is we change the blending mode of this layer that we're going to clone onto from normal blend mode to darken blend mode. And when we do that, a whole lot of different things happen. Now I'm going to do this with a size of paintbrush that was larger than I would normally use, but this will give you a sense of what happens. So we select our source point here using the Alt key to click in and select a source area, and then we can then clone in down the edge. And you'll see here that I've darkened that fringe area away, but it hasn't darkened the part of the figure that we want to maintain. But it's not quite perfect, and there's another way that we will do that. We'll just go back to our history tool and come back to our beginning with this new blank layer, select it to darken blend mode. But with the clone tool, what we want to do is we want to reduce the opacity of that clone tool from 100% back to something like about 60 to 70%, so that we're not fully cloning over what we're trying to cover, and we can build that up with a couple of layers. And the other thing we would do is we would zoom in quite closely onto this, and you'll see here there's a little bit of nasty color fringing, and we can get rid of that by reducing the size of our stamp and selecting the source point as close to where we want it to be cloned over as possible, because even with this sky that's been dramatically darkened, there are lighter and darker patches. So if we hit our source tool as close as possible to that area we want to clone over, and then using the clone stamp, and we can go over a little bit over the edge, and you'll see here I've removed a lot of that fringing, but it's not completely gone. And if we find that that's the situation, we can come back and go over a second time just to clean up those areas where it's a little bit stronger. Now if I come back out and I go over to the other side of this figure, you'll see that there's quite a lot of noise in this part of the sky, but we'll solve that a little bit later. But on this side, the fringing isn't as bad, so we can come back in, select our new source point, and start to paint in. Now what this will not do, it won't remove that darker line from around the edges that's probably an artifact of a little bit of over sharpening, but we can certainly get rid of those light lines, and we can fix that by just going into those areas and painting over them, and if needs be even go back over a couple of times to darken it in. And that's the way that we can really remove those nasty lines. And again, down under the bottom of the figure we've got a similar situation. My masking or selection of my sky wasn't perfect, so we can come in again, select our source point, clone over that, and even see this little area here. I don't really want that to be highlighted, so select my source point, come in over that, and you'll see that I'm just painting over and it's not affecting any other area, and we can then fill in these areas quite simply. Now this will take a little bit of time, but the beauty of this is you don't have to worry about keeping those edges clean, because the blend mode will do that work for you. Now that's the one I've just worked on. Here's the version that I finished earlier, and if we zoom back out and have a look at some of those rather nasty areas that we had a problem with earlier, you can see that by going around carefully, not only have we removed the fringing, but we've also removed that little bit of a color cast, because cloning over those areas that are highlighted along the edges will remove that little bit of color bleeding that occurs sometimes when it's been a little bit too aggressive. And there are parts of this figure where the fringing isn't too bad, and there are other parts, well, I can see here for instance an area that I've missed between just this part here, so let's just go back and clone that area out now, and I'm going to source from over here and just clone in and repair that. And the same thing here, and I can even use a larger brush for this part, because I can see that those areas are quite a lot darker, and I've got no problems with the blending not working terribly well, although we do have a little bit of a darker line, so we can just try and blend that in a little bit better. With a little bit of care you can build up this treatment all around the figure, and you'll get rid of this light fringing line from wherever it occurs, and using that blend mode of darken and the clone tool at reduced opacity, you can then build up the effect where you need to and keep it fairly gentle where you don't need it to be super aggressive. Now one last thing I wanted to mention while we're looking at this cloning around the figure, you're going to need to move your source point constantly as you're cloning. As you're moving around the figure, you're going to have to then constantly reset the source point, just so that you're keeping those areas that you're cloning from as consistent as possible. And it does take a little bit of time, but it's well worth the effort if you're going to produce something that you want to print or display at large size. All those little defects will be obvious if you don't fix them up at this stage. So while it does take a little bit of time, It doesn't need to be super precise because the blending mode will solve that problem of that light line and that dark edge for you. But then we're still left with a little bit of rather aggressive noise from some of this processing that I've done. And how do we fix that? Well, once you've done all of that work, what we would do then is make a new composite layer of your cloned in area and all the other work below, and that's done by using the keystrokes Control, Alt, Shift and E, or on a Mac it would be Command, Alt, Shift, E, and you produce a new composite layer. Now to remove this noise, I'm going to use a plugin called Topaz Denoise, which is an absolutely remarkable package that you have to pay for, but it is well worth spending the money on. And if you make your composite layer, we'll go then into Topaz Labs Denoise, and that will bring up the plugin filter, which on my computer appears on another screen. So let's just bring this over here, and let's just move this window up to some part of the image where we can see the noise. Now I've got this on a split screen view, so that on the right hand side is after the denoise has been applied, and on the left you'll see the original image. And if I move that over, you'll see that it's done quite a good job of removing most of that noise, and even with the sharpening turned right down to the minimum levels, it is still applying a little bit of sharpening, and you will start to see still a little bit of noise appearing there, and it's probably a little bit of artifact of sharpening. But by playing around with the sliders here, and we want to remove as much noise as possible without completely destroying the image. But you'll see if you look at some of these rocks here, even with no more sharpening being applied, it is still putting a little bit of an edge on those areas, and it is starting to introduce a little bit of edge back into our image. So we need to be fairly careful with how we apply this, but let's assume that we're happy with those settings as they are. And I can, if I went all the way up to 100%, you will see that the denoise is going to be super aggressive and probably start to destroy some of the image qualities. But let's go with that. Let's click on apply, and depending on the power of your computer, the processing will take longer or shorter. This machine has quite a lot of RAM and processing power, so this will work fairly quickly, but in normal circumstances it might take a little bit longer. So it's now applied those changes, and it will take us back into Photoshop and give us the overlay of the image. Now here is the layer, and I'm just going to rename that Topaz Denoise. And if we zoom in, you can see that it's done a pretty good job of removing that noise from the background in the sky, but you might find that it's starting to soften some of these edges a bit too. So the easy way to control that is to just bring back the opacity of that layer to the point where you start to see that grain reappearing in the background, and I think that that's probably an acceptable compromise. Bear in mind that when you're going to print an image like this, if you're even printing to A2 size and you've got a fairly high resolution image to start with, you're going to be downsampling the image, so a lot of that noise will disappear anyway. But let's just assume that we wanted to remove most of that noise, and we've now got an image that not only looks great, has some really nice processing applied to it, and we've managed to get rid of those nasty artifacts. So I hope that's been useful for you. Please put some comments in the comment section, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.